Keri Lynn, can you believe we finally got to this point?
It seems incredible, and yet here we are, and I am so excited.
We have been talking about using our podcast as part of knowledge translation since the get-go. And I like to think we've been doing that a little bit as we have moved throughout our now over a year of episode launches. But this month, August 2024, holds a special place for me, for our project, for our research, because this month, we are launching what I have been referring to, at least in my head, as a trifecta of an episode. Although this one episode is in 3 parts, it's really one episode, but it's super long and super detailed and super exciting, I think.
I think so too. And I think the reason that we get to play with this length that you allude to is the fact that we had some incredible participants with whom we got to co-create digital stories. And this is our opportunity to match you, our beloved listeners, with our participants and their stories and kind of let you know some of the also very cool things that Kathy and I get to do apart from being a part of this fabulous podcast.
So let's back things up a smidge and let people know about our research project. Our research project, which is funded, and we're very grateful for our funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, is part of an Insight grant. And we started this a few years back, but our research in MAiD started back even further than that. And so I'm going to lean back out for a bit and just talk a little bit about how we got interested in researching, as qualitative researchers, medical assistance in dying. So way back when, in 2016, we were both quite interested and living in Thunder Bay or close thereabout, what the rollout of medical assistance in dying was going to look like specifically in the North. Our regular listeners, no doubt, are pretty familiar when I get on my soapbox and I talk about equitable access to a palliative approach to care, to good end-of-life care. And I, of course, was wondering what this was going to look like for MAiD as well. And so Keri and I went across Northwestern Ontario and we spoke with physicians and said, like, what's happening? What's it look like on the landscape of Northwestern Ontario? And we heard really loud and clear from the physicians that, yeah, their experience was one thing, but if we wanted to really understand medical assistance in dying, we had to speak to those people who were accompanying someone who used MAiD at the end of life. And so we did that. And in partnership with my fabulous co-investigators, Dr. Kim Wilson at the University of Guelph and Dr. Arne Stinchcombe, now at the University of Ottawa, we applied for and got a SSHRC, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Insight Development Grant, where we were looking at the experiences of people who'd accompanied someone who used MAiD across Ontario. And we did this through qualitative research methods of interviews and then digital stories. And so we created those stories and then got interested in thinking about, if this is what the landscape's looking like in Ontario, what's happening in the rest of the country? Because we know that healthcare is delivered differently in each and every province. And so Dr. Stinchcombe and Dr. Wilson and I put together this other SSHRC-funded grant that this podcast is part of. And the digital stories that this month you are going to have access to and be able to hear from the creators is very much part of that. And we did this because as part of our first grant looking at family members and friends' experience with MAiD, we hosted a research symposium. And because it was during COVID, we did it online and we opened it up to whoever wanted to come. And if you remember, Keri Lynn, we were a little bit surprised by who decided to show up.
I do remember. And I remember being very pleasantly surprised too at the number of people who joined us.
Yeah, so we used a platform called Feedloop, and so we managed to get a few organizations that we now have stronger partnerships. Bridge C14, MAiD Family Support Society, Canadian Virtual Hospice House. You've heard from Tekla Henderson as part of our podcast. And these people had booths to show participants what kind of supports and services were available to them. And then because it was free and online, we had over 250 people show up to hear some of the findings from our research, to see some of the digital stories and ask questions. And I think, Keri Lynn, this is where it was really eye-opening for me. As a researcher with her head in the sand, often focused on this one piece of end-of-life care that is MAiD, I forgot how little sometimes we manage to get the message out, or how much more education is required for people. And so some of the questions that we were asked made us think we need to do something different about building capacity and knowledge within communities as it pertains to medical assistance in dying. And that was kind of the motivation for the podcast. So I'm really hoping what listeners are hearing is how we've taken our experiences doing research in this space and are trying to translate that and how we got to today with our digital stories. So a brief background around our SSHRC-funded Insight grant that we're doing right now. It has 3 phases. The first phase is conducting interviews with people who are accessing medical assistance in dying. And we've been doing that for a couple of years. And we have heard from a wide variety of people at different stages in their journeys, including someone that you are going to hear from today, Diane Sims. Our second phase is conducting focus groups and individual interviews with people who've accompanied someone from across Canada. So people who have been a family member or a friend, chosen family or a biological family of someone who has used medical assistance in dying at the end of their lives. We want to hear from you. So we have done this in a few different provinces at this point. And then we built on our partnerships with Bridge C14 and MAiD Family Support. And we did some digital stories that you're going to hear about a lot today. But before we get into that, I just want to also let you know that our research has a third phase. The third phase is that we, of course, are going to want to know what healthcare providers are thinking about medical assistance in dying. And we're going to use a survey to do that. And hopefully, fingers crossed, convince some of them to also engage in digital storytelling creation as well.
What an explanation. You leave no gaps. As a researcher of many, many years, I expect nothing less from you. However, now I'm going to turn the table a little bit because our research starts with people.
Yes.
And I want to ask you not so much about the research, but I want to hear about you as a researcher. Because here we've been doing this podcast for over a year now. And we show up and we talk, and you've just outlined all the incredible things that we get to do. Who are you behind all of what we get to do? Are you up for the task, Kathy? Are you up for a few questions about you as a researcher?
Probably not. But before we do this, I need to be really clear that this is a team event. We're watching the Olympics a lot right now in my household.
Of course.
This is very much a team event. Research is done best with a group of people who support the work. And so while Keri Lynn, that you're going to be asking me questions, I of course acknowledged already the co-investigators, Dr. Stinchcombe and Dr. Wilson. But there's also been a team of people more located closer to where I live at Lakehead University, both virtually and otherwise. Of course, yourself, Keri Lynn, as we were just sort of joking, if it's not too painful, when we talked about how you joined our work as a PhD student. And now you continue as somebody who has graduated with your PhD. We have a number of MSW students and other graduate students who have been affiliated with this project. And so while you're going to be asking me about my experiences, I want to make sure that those people feel acknowledged and that their contributions are also recognized. So of course, people are quite familiar with the fabulous Sadie, who was an MSW student at Lakehead, working with me and is now continuing on as the producer of the program. We have had a number of other MSW students. I would like to do a big shout out to everyone who, because of their graduate school education, have been part of what we call HQPs, highly qualified personnel, as we have been growing, hopefully, not only solid social work clinicians who are out there, but also people who are passionate about doing qualitative research.
True. Okay, spoken like a true social worker. It takes a village, but I really need to also jump in. Well, I don't need to, but I'm going to, with the fact that, yes, while we are all on a team and it's a great honor, and Sadie and I have conversations about how we grow and learn on the daily, I think it's also important to acknowledge that it takes someone willing, someone with the academic acumen, willing to take that leap forward into this kind of research. Because digital storytelling, while it's been around for many decades, it's only really been used as a tool in research for the last, and then even that, people will look at me and say, wow, oh, okay, is that what's going on? And et cetera. And now it's really getting exciting to see it in health qualitative research and in areas where we didn't get to see it before. So I want to make sure that people understand that, when I tell people that I did this as my doctoral thesis, digital storytelling, you were the person behind that and the person who drove that train right from the beginning. So it does take that initial jump. And yes, hats off to Arn and Kim as well, who've always been in my corner. But today, Kathy, is about you. So without further ado, we know about you as a professor. We know about you as a podcast co-host. But can you tell us a little bit about yourself as a researcher, please?
Sure. I am solely a qualitative researcher. I think it links, and if there's any of my former or present social work students listening to this, I have the privilege of teaching a graduate level applied research course, a qualitative one, to our MSW students at Lakehead University. And I very much preach and scream from the rooftops that a lot of the clinical skills that we have as social workers work really well as qualitative researchers. We do interviews, we engage in group work, we ask people difficult questions, we hold space in a way that allows people to be vulnerable and to feel safe. And so utilizing the clinical skills that I have as a social worker fit well for me as a qualitative researcher. And as a social worker and as a qualitative researcher, social justice is really important to me, and it is high on my list of priorities. And I want to engage in research that makes change and that also is situated in community. And digital storytelling is one of the methods that really attracted me because it allows us to do that. It allows us to take what we're learning from a research perspective and link it with the people who need that information, to be able to share the stories, to be able to share the experiences that people can then use to build upon with their own.
I really like that because it really speaks to that idea that you could see it as, as an teaching applied skills in your social work seminars and groups. You're really looking for how you can apply these tools beyond the research, which is really cool because you're going to people and you're asking them, as you've said, to be vulnerable, but you're affording them a space within which they can take those kind of risks with their thoughts, their feelings, their perspectives, their views, and you're going to be there to hold it. Can you recall when you first heard about digital storytelling and tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dr. Kim Wilson, who I referenced at the University of Guelph, introduced me to digital storytelling from the onset. And she had been working with a great group of researchers at the University of Guelph at the Red Lab. And Arn and Kim and I, as part of another SSHRC Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council funded Insight Development Grant on valuing the perspectives of LGBTQ plus older adults in Canada, we went and learned about how to create digital stories. And we were participants, courtesy of the Red Lab, in creating digital stories. So we got to be part of that process, from feeling, uncertain and vulnerable and not really knowing what digital stories were all about, to creating our own and then thinking about how we were going to use those in research.
I really like that in particular because you really show evidence of, walking the talk mentality, right? That you were prepared to put yourself into that position. Again, action yourself into it and say, what does it feel like to do this? How am I feeling? What are the potential thoughts, feelings, experiences of a participant, right? So again, knowing that you're going to want to hold that space, throughout the participant experience, which is really important.
And I think it's essential for this. And I also want to acknowledge that the actual work that goes into creating the digital stories, so the digital technology part of it, is not one of my strengths. I can do it. I'm not great at it. It takes me a lot of time. And so one of the things that having funded research, and again, shout out to SSHRC for funding us, it allows me to use part of my strengths, working with Arn and Kim to create the grants to develop the research protocol to be able to hire people such as yourself, Keri and Sadie, and we're going to, of course, talk about Mike Lang as we move forward, to expand our reach in terms of crafting these stories that people are going to be able to access today.
That really speaks to that idea of it takes a village. You know, my mother was in a business for many years, and one of her things that she says she needed to learn very quickly was to hire the right people and get the hell out of the way. And I think that's a wonderful thing, because what that speaks to is that idea that you can acknowledge in others those things that you find challenging or perhaps aren't your forte. And you say, I know you've got this. Can you go? Can you do your thing? Can you make your magic? And then we're going to blend it all together, and it's going to, turn into the mosaic that we're hoping it to be.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm reminded of Dr. Mary Lou Kelly, who is a mentor of mine. And she always says, find the one thing that you can do that no one else can. And then find the other people who can support and work to their strengths as well.
Right. It sounds like Mary Lou and my mother should have a glass of wine.
Probably.
What are some of the joys of using digital storytelling research in research? What are some of the joys or the highlights for you as a researcher?
There are so many. I love the synergy and the magic of the screening session, the very last one in the digital workshop, when people come together and share their stories for the first time, that someone else other than the digital story creator and a member of the research team to see it as a group and to watch people's responses. I love that moment. I also love to think about the reach of the stories. And that's something that we're doing a bit differently and, dare I say, better with this research project, having learned from previous ones. But this leans back into that original SSHRC IDG that Dr. Stinchcombe had when we were creating digital stories with older adults who identified as 2S LGBTQ+. And I remember one participant in particular who wanted her story shown widely, and also reached out to me knowing that I was teaching research at a graduate level, and said, can we share my story in your research class so I can talk about what it's like to be a research participant with future researchers, and share the story. And where the power of digital stories happens is when we think about some of our generational knowledge gaps. And I'm sorry if I'm getting a little bit too in the weeds here, but I just love this moment. I'm going to try and shorten it. It's when some of the students in my courses who would identify as 2S LGBTQ+ didn't know some of the history, didn't know some of the advocacy, didn't know some of the work that older adults had achieved and fought for and advocated for, so that we can have some of the rights that we have today as Canadians. And so to see that happen in a research class, to recognize how we can then share and use that as education, to me, is some of the big benefits to be able to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. As an educator, I love that too. I love when a young learner looks at someone and says, oh, I had no idea that's how it was for you. I think those are real aha moments that are very powerful for both.
And I think listeners for our podcast are going to get a little bit of that when they get to hear from our most recent participants, who will talk a little bit about their experiences making the digital story and then go and see the digital story. And I think one of the pieces that really sits with me and sometimes weighs heavily is the responsibility as researchers, when people trust us to create the digital story and then say, yes, I want this story to be shared widely. I need this story to be shared widely. This is important to me. And that can be a heavy responsibility, but I also think a really important one. And so I, again, send my heartfelt thanks to every participant who has decided to entrust us and be part of the research. And that has become, I would say, a member of our research team through the creation of their digital story and by taking the risk to share it with people.
That's super cool that you say that, because I think participants own their stories. That's the way our research works, that they create their story. They are now the owner of the story. Then when they disseminate the story, when they share their story, I like to think that they take on that role of not look at what I made per se, but are you listening? Are you watching? Are you hearing the story? And if so, tell me about what you're hearing. Tell me about what you're seeing. What are you witnessing? Because we look through the lens that we look through. And I think that's
Yeah.
very interesting about how people will bring themselves to everybody's story as they view it. What are some of the challenges of using digital storytelling in research?
Many. I would say I have been incredibly lucky and have gotten really lucky with the relationships of the members on our research team that we gather together to do these stories. So that could be very challenging for people. I want to acknowledge that I got lucky and have a strong team. One of the pieces I want to highlight that has been a really important value of our research team as it pertains to digital stories is something I said before. I'm not great with the digital story technology. I can do it, but I also understand what it's like to struggle with it. And so as a result, it was really important to me and the research team that potential participants knew that we would have the capacity to support them in the creation of their digital story, regardless of their ability to navigate technology. And so we never wanted technology to be a barrier for someone to tell their story. And for me, that's a big one when it comes to digital stories, because I think that there are so many benefits of them, but most of the work that I have the privilege of doing tends to be with older adults. And while there are many whizzes out there in terms of navigating Zoom and all sorts of different technologies, sometimes there are people who struggle, but still have such an essential and important story to tell. So for me, that was one of the challenges.
That does seem definitely a challenge. I think going back to your comment about equity too, we know in our research, just to tack on to what you've shared, that there are places in Canada where, even the internet access can be difficult. Or we know that human beings are not automatons that sit within Wi-Fi perfect spaces all the time and are often on the move. Or people who are in transition and need to be kind of accommodated in different spaces. The only thing I want to add to your comment is I can recall actually sitting in my loo and recording some information with a participant because at the time that was the perfect place to do it. It was the quietest. It was the place where we could, share and make sure that I held that space. So I think the challenges are definitely there with some of the technology, but also too, the person behind the technology, right? As you said, how comfortable are you with the software? How comfortable are you with me sending you how to upload the software, et cetera, and being open to all of that? Silver surfers, my mom likes to call them, people who didn't grow up with the internet, and how are they feeling about all of it?
I love that. Silver surfers. And one of the things I'm really proud of with our research team is we have always put the person before the technology. And the technology has been part of what allows us to do what we do, be it during COVID, be it just solely because of geography. Canada's a really big place. And again, I want to do a shout out in case anyone's listening. We need better Wi-Fi access in Northwestern Ontario. Please, if people can make that happen, that'd be lovely. And I know there's other areas in Canada that could use it as well.
Would you recommend digital storytelling in research to a colleague?
I would, if they knew what they were getting into. Or actually, no, maybe it's better if you don't know exactly what you're getting into.
Yeah.
When you were saying before about the things that were going on and people moving, and I also think about life events that occurred. I think we've celebrated a handful of grandbabies being born. People have literally moved from one end of the country to the other. There, of course, have been people who have died. People have been actively grieving. There have been job celebrations that have occurred. All the things have happened within our digital stories telling continuum, can we call it that? But I think that also strengthened the relationship that we have developed with our, I hesitate to call people participants in research, although that is the term, but our co-members of our research team.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost like a community, really. And I like that you talked about so many of the life events that happened because life happened, while you're busy doing other stuff. So it's that what you said at the very beginning about the person, the people putting them first. So yes, absolutely. Oh, this is happening for you in your life. Then let's figure out how we're going to do this. As a digital storytelling student, when I was learning how to do all of this, we had people moving from active wildfires. So we did that online because it was during COVID. And there would be people showing up in their van in another state in the United States because they were actively keeping safe. So interesting. What's next for you and digital storytelling in research? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I'm really excited to see how the digital stories are shared with the podcast, with the YouTube channel, also with our partnership organizations, Bridge C14 and MAiD Family Support Society, who were phenomenal in terms of helping us recruit people who'd be willing to engage in the creation of digital stories. So in terms of what's next, Keri, I think it's kind of what you and I have been talking about, how we're extending and doing things a little bit different on this grant in terms of paying attention to what are people who've created their digital stories, how are they using them? How are they sharing them? And what are they learning from that experience? So we're looking a little bit at that. Also, of course, we're going to be sharing the digital stories widely and hoping that people are using them in the classroom with healthcare provider education. And we're going to pay attention to what that looks like. As I alluded to before, as phase 3 of this present Insight grant supported by SSHRC, we're going to be getting information about healthcare providers' experience with MAiD. And I'm hoping to learn from healthcare providers in terms of their experiences with medical assistance in dying. And we've had the privilege on our podcast to hear from a number of physicians. We've heard from Dr. Green, we've heard from Dr. Jayaraman, we have heard from Dr. Myers. I'm hopeful we'll hear from some more, but we need to remember, and I have to remind myself, of course, that there are other healthcare providers involved intimately in the provision of MAiD for Canadians. And so we would like to hear from them as well and learn about their experiences as part of the research. And who knows, they might end up on the podcast as well.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to let you off the hook because I know talking about you specifically is not your favorite thing. You've done it beautifully because you've done it as a community effort, which, yeah, as I said, I expect nothing less from you. And you always give us kudos. And I know for a fact that Sadie and I are very grateful for that. So this part 1 of the trifecta, as you refer, we're going to get to talk to Diane Sims. Can you kind of give our listeners a little bit of a background as to how we learned about Diane, please?
Sure. So as listeners are probably more than familiar with, at our conclusion of every episode, we do a call and we said, hey, if you'd like to talk to us, if there's something you think we should know about, please get in touch. And Diane did just that. She reached out to the website and said, hey, I am Diane Sims. I am someone who is accessing MAiD, and I've told my story in Maclean's, and I'd love to talk with you. And so that's how I connected with Diane, and she became part of our research project. And then she expressed an interest in doing digital stories, because that is a question that we ask as part of our consent and in our information letters as part of our research project. And I connected Diane with you.
As unique as Diane is, and I know this for a fact because I got to hang out with her as much as I did, why is Diane different than some of the other, well, all of the other participants that you're going to hear from when you listen to this fabulous episode, listeners? Why is she different?
For me, she is different as she is someone who is living with MS, and she is someone who is thinking about how she wants to live until she dies, but also keeps thinking about what needs to be in place before she accesses MAiD. I think we will hear some of that in some of the digital stories that are created by people who've accompanied someone, but Diane is someone who is still living and breathing and is in the process of utilizing MAiD. Is that what you were looking for?
Yeah, it was. I just want people to be able to wade in knowing that they're going to, it's not a spoiler alert, but almost like a, let's take care of you. When I've shown Diane's story, it's the one that really gets people because they look at me and say, she's like the epitome of lived experience, right? That kind of touches on the vulnerability you talked about, but also being the go-getter and the trailblazer that Diane is, she's like, got to get this message out there no matter what. So what is that going to look like?
And if I can add one more piece, something from a digital story process piece that made it a little bit different was Diane wasn't part of a group the way the other digital stories were created. Diane had her story created individually, working one-on-one with the fabulous Keri, who's going to talk a little bit about that. And you will also notice that Diane's story is a bit longer than the rest of them. And that was done purposefully because we followed Diane's direction and she had that length of story that she wanted to tell. But also because of the one-on-one, the way that story was developed or facilitated allowed for that to be able to happen in a different way. So now I think what we're finally at the point, you get to hear from Diane herself, and she and Keri Lynn are going to talk about what the creation of the digital story process was like.
Hi, Diane.
Hi, Keri Lynn.
Having done the interview initially with Kathy, why did you decide that the digital story was something that you would like to do with us?
I thought it was really important to do it to help educate people about and to take away some of the fear of making the decision. Besides, it sounded like a really cool project.
Excellent. And on the heels of your now nominated article in Maclean's magazine, did the offer of a digital story afford you a different way to educate the public?
Absolutely. Now that the stories in pictures and music and voiceover, those are wonderful ways to tell a story. You know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I've written my story, but this is a whole new venue, and I would encourage anyone who has the opportunity to do this, because it opens up more opportunities, assuming your reasons are valid for doing it, then it's not self-glory. But if you want to educate and inform, then this is a wonderful venue.
I think that's a nice segue into my next question for you. What were your overall feelings when we were creating your story? We talk a lot about how process is as important, if not even perhaps more important for the participant than the product itself, the story at the end of it. What were your overall feelings during the process?
Oh, first I would say excitement. But it was very thoughtful, very thought-provoking, and it really required a lot of thought and effort on my part and on your part, big time on your part, to pull it together. But it was exciting, and it was an adventure, and it was a whole new way of telling the story.
I like that. I'm not in any way hoping to lead you, because as a journalist, I know that you wouldn't appreciate that. But were there any things that weren't perhaps as positive in terms of feelings? Were there things that you would want to share with our listeners about maybe moments of doubt or moments of reconsideration or anything like that?
There were moments of extreme sadness because we were doing it so close to my brother's death that there's sadness. There was doubt about using that, but it was a wonderful way to introduce the story. And I mean, I got past those feelings, not past them, I got through them and back to the, thinking about the next section. And as I said, there was overall excitement through the process.
Diane, with whom have you shared your digital story so far?
I've shared it with family and friends, and friends have been incredibly supportive. Family, not as much so. My religious family are quite appalled by it, and other family members are disturbed by it. But friends have been very supportive, and every once in a while I look and I see, it's had 77 looks, and I wonder what people thought. If they must have just happened upon it or been looking for something on MAiD and it pops up right away. So I hope that, I don't know what it is today. Maybe it's up to 83. Never know.
No, you don't.
And I hope it's helped educate or inform those people.
That, again, you're a pro. My next question is really, and even those people who weren't particularly supportive or were openly not happy about your digital story or MAiD in general or your choices, etc., what are the takeaways that you hope a viewer of your digital story will kind of take for themselves?
Well, I know for two of the religious people, it's made them think, and that is an incredible feat that they've admitted they're thinking about this, that they were so impressed with the quality of the production and what was said, the music used, pictures used, the photographs. So that has been a wonderful takeaway. That it's made people think. Maybe some people who looked at it online, even if somebody was angry or upset about it and watched it, maybe they thought twice about it or thought once about it. So that's the takeaway I'm hoping for.
And you used that word before in our talk today about thoughtful. People who are asked to really think about what they're watching and think about where they are, the lens that they're looking through, where they are with that.
Yes.
I'm going to go off on a slight tangent because you did talk about the takeaways where you felt that people who were adverse or anti really kind of gave it a watch and were asked to think about those views that they've held.
Yes.
What do you think it is about the digital story format that might invoke that kind of response from someone as opposed to, say, a printed article or a news report? Where do you think that's coming from?
Because it involves so many senses. You're listening, you're watching, you're actually reading at times. You're stimulated by this type of medium and stimulated in many ways. And that's what it's exciting about it. You're not just watching a movie. You can actually listen. If you want, you can just go through and listen to the music. You can go through and watch pictures. You can go through and read. You can go through and listen to the words. So I think this is a very exciting way to tell a story.
And in that sense, of course, a very exciting way to engage with a story.
Oh,
that's the word that kept popping into my head while you were talking, this whole kind of idea where it's almost a visceral kind of
it is
experience on all these different levels, which is really interesting.
Yes.
And I think it demands of the viewer a much more active participation.
It does. You cannot be passive. You've got to be engaged, watching and listening to this. I don't even know how to best describe it to people other than it does engage all your senses.
Yeah, that's marvelous, isn't it? So, Diane, I shared with you before we went on air that you are, to date, our only participant who has chosen to do a digital story after the interview. And that's exciting. You know, you're the trailblazer, if you will. What advice would you give another person who has chosen MAiD? What advice would you give, or perhaps recommendations, a better word? Would you recommend the digital storytelling process to another person?
Yes, because it makes you think your whole process through with all your senses. It makes you work the process through.
So it's often said about digital storytelling that it can be transformative for the audience, but also for the creator of the story. So what you've done really nicely there is you've implied, if I've inferred correctly, that while the audience is busy being multi-engaged, you too were in that zone creating the story.
Absolutely. Because, as I said, you have to work the process. So you are working every aspect of that digital storytelling.
And that's got to be a healthy thing, right? That's got to be a good thing. Yeah.
Very good.
And a valuable thing.
Very valuable, very healthy, very stimulating as well. Because I can't be passive about it either.
Yeah. So
this is an active choice I've made, and I cannot remain passive about it.
Yeah, I really like that. The educator in me says, yes, that's how good education happens, when we're actively engaged. And we're not passively sucking things up, but we're looking at things and being challenged by things, and being asked to really, as you say, think about what's in front of us.
Yes, and the fact that these two people in California are thinking, rethinking their automatic no to the whole process. They're rethinking it. And
that's paradigm shift.
That is a paradigm shift.
Well done you.
Well done you.
Well done us.
Well, yes, well done us.
What a lovely way to end it. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Keri, whenever I hear Diane, I am reminded how fierce she is. And I am reminded of how much living she does in the moment. I hear the deep grief, having experienced the death of her brother while she was engaging in this process, but also know how important it was for her to work with you and create her own digital story during this challenging time.
Fierce is a great word. I had the opportunity to work, as you've said, with Diane one-to-one. Her ferocity came across immediately. What also comes across to me about Diane is her vivacity, her incredible joie de vivre, and her incredible mission perhaps might be the wrong word, but there is a fire in Diane to get the word out, to make sure that her legacy includes what her understanding of medical assistance in dying is. She even toys in her story about the fact that she thought she was going to lead the way and educate her brother, her beloved Harvey, in the MAiD experience, and that he preempts that by choosing MAiD himself in the weeks before she and I get to talk to one another. She is a still presence in the sense that it's all in there, and she's so skilled as a journalist in getting all of those things to the surface and out. She's a consummate professional, and it was a real privilege to be part of that because of who she is as a journalist and as a MAiD educator, but also as a rocking human being.
A rocking human being for sure. And one that I think we both feel so blessed and lucky to have had the privilege to work with and continue to work with. So, dear listener, please lean in and take care of yourself as you listen and witness and view Diane's story that she has created. Go check out the YouTube channel on our website under Digital Stories. And if you want to let us know, as we ask every episode about how we're doing, other stories, or how the digital stories impacted you, please don't hesitate to do that. Connect with us on our socials. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and you can also just email our website as well. We would love to hear from you. And I know Diane would love to hear how her story impacts you as well. Part B is going to be the sharing of the digital stories from the group that we gathered together courtesy of our collaboration with Bridge C14. So be sure to keep joining us, and let's keep the conversation going.
Did we get here, and how? Your stories mean everything now. Did we get here, and how? Your stories mean everything now. Ooh.